So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Keisha Brown. She's a professor at Tennessee State University in the Department of History, Political Science, Geography, and Africana Studies, which sounds like a fascinating department to be part of. And I bet you and your colleagues have lots of very, very interesting conversations. Keisha received a BA from Notre Dame, double major in American Studies and Chinese, and her PhD is from USC. She's a pioneering scholar in the field that she has created called Sino-Black Studies, or I'm sorry, Sino-Black Relations. She's a historian of modern China, but also with a corresponding interest in race and ethnicity issues, post-colonial theory, social and cultural history in modern East Asia. So we've got somebody that clearly is a Renaissance woman, given the number of fields that she touches on. You know, for those of you that are interested in China, this whole issue of race relations in China and Chinese views of, you know, Blacks in the Black diaspora has always been an interesting one in the background. So we're very excited to have her here today. As a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Keisha, and she does have a PowerPoint set of slides that she's going to share. This event is being sponsored by the Asian Studies program, but also it's part of the Asia In-Depth series that Professor Jim Millward runs, as well as the History Department of Georgetown University. So we're a little bit more disaggregated than Tennessee State, but we manage to all come together every once in a while. There are a lot of people on this attending today, and I just ask if you would mute yourself until we get to the Q&A period. And Keisha, we agreed, what, about 20, 30 minutes? How long do you want to speak for, Keisha?
I'll say 30 minutes, just so we can have more time for the Q&A. So 30 minutes, yeah.
Great. We'll do 30 minutes. The session is being recorded. The recording is going to become available in the coming days on the Asian Studies website. Everybody knows that. If they don't, please email Stephanie Gage. To ask questions during the Q&A, you can unmute yourself, and the easiest way, the best way to do this is to use the raise hand function, because the raise hand function in Zoom now queues up based on who hits the buzzer first. So we try and maintain some degree of equity and some degree of decorum. So I ask that you use the raise hand function, and I, as the moderator, will just sort of go down the list. And Keisha's been very graciously said she could go over 5 o'clock a little bit, because I know there'll be a lot of questions. And I think that's about it. So with that, Keisha, over to you, and thank you again for joining us. We've been very excited about your presentation. So over to you.
All right. Can everyone see the screen itself? Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and actually kind of begin to introduce the topic. So again, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the invitation and the offer to speak on this topic. As you know, Evan mentioned, that is so timely, and it really is engaging a lot of conversations and questions today. And so I want to focus on kind of two things in thinking about Sino-Black relations and what that is and what my research does in this particular field, as well as thinking about anti-Blackness in China and how we kind of engage these conversations. I came to this topic based on my own experiences living, working, and traveling in China, and also conversations in the Asian studies space where it was very difficult to kind of talk about and think through questions of racism and how we see this playing out in China, or in some ways the idea of China's not racist, or how we would in some ways engage in these conversations and these dialogues about the ways in which you think about race and terminology in different places and spaces, and how to be sensitive to not in some ways reinforce Western ideas and terminology onto places that have different ways of thinking about difference and othering. And so I just kind of want to talk a little bit about that today, go through some terms and key concepts, and think about some of the examples and some of the history as well. So when I was preparing this, I'm going to show you this clip. I was preparing this and I was thinking through, you know, how can I begin this conversation and where do I want to start? And unfortunately, it was maybe a few days after I began my outline on the project, the John Boyega and the Joe Malone kind of controversy popped up. And so what happened in this particular incident is that John Boyega, who's not in some ways unfamiliar to the Chinese market, he was in Star Wars film and how, in ways in which they modified his appearance on that poster. So he's not unfamiliar, but he did this ad campaign with Joe Malone, which is a global brand. He's one of their global ambassadors. And in the ad, he was actually given kind of creative control. And they said, I want you to create an ad around this fragrance. What does it make you feel? How do you think about using this particular product? And so he created an ad that was very unique to his experience as what he called a London gent. And so he takes you through kind of his home, and he uses other places and individuals that are personal to him. He has friends and family members. He takes you through his view of London, what he sees as London. And so the ad was out there and actually won an award for the way in which it was just seen as a really great creative ad. And so it's an award-winning ad, but when it made its way globally, when it went to China, it was shot completely different. They actually took him out and scene for scene, replaced him with a Chinese actor himself. And so I want to show you the clip. Originally, I was going to show the one that was side by side, but it's a little too distracting when you're trying to focus on both at the same time. And so I was able to find a YouTube video where it shows his original ad and then the one that replaced it. And I want to kind of open up and think about this conversation because when he went on Twitter to denounce working with Joe Malone, when he severed his ties with this large brand, it brought up other questions about thinking about anti-Blackness, especially on the heels of the events that happened in April and early this year in China as a response to kind of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can everyone hear the ad? Okay.
When I look at where I'm coming from, I know I'm blessed, and I close my eyes and smile. Sometimes I feel like the richest man in Babylon, and I've done my best, so everything's alright. As far as I can, yeah. As far as I can, I can, yeah. With my two hands in the air, as far as I can.
And I want to kind of hold on to what we just saw and what we kind of think through that particular ad itself. And as we come back to this conversation about, in the cases, he was very frustrated because it was his personal project. It was one he had creative control of. It was very personal to him and how they reproduced it without his consent. He did not know that it was being redone until he saw the kind of display of this particular ad. And so the questions were about why in some ways was he replaced and very much why was it in some ways done for the Chinese market. And it gets to these questions of thinking about anti-Blackness and how we can think about and talk about race in China. And many times I'm asked about the question where this idea of, can we talk about these particular concepts and how we do so? And many times I talk about race in China space, I get two kind of responses and pushback. The first is, we don't have racial groups in China. We have the Xiaoxuminzu. ethnic nationalities, not races, and therefore we can't be racist, R-A-C-I-S-T. And another one is the idea that, China as a nation state itself and as an entity did not enslave Africans. It was not part of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. And therefore, because of that lack of that kind of historical legacy of enslavement and colonialism, that they're not in some ways racist in the same ways other places are. And so how do in some ways you engage these conversations and in some ways allow for your experience as a Black person traveling to China to be seen as valid? Because the ways in which those two conversations are dismissive of these ideas are also dismissive of the experience of the people who identify as Black, who travel, navigate, and make their livelihood in China. And so how do we have conversations that in some ways amplifies those voices, kind of highlight some of the problems and how we think about moving forward in terms of solutions and how we address some of these questions, not just in the China space, but also in some ways in the larger institutions that do work on China as well. Think about the ways in which we're in some ways encouraging certain scholarship and others are not getting encouragement. How do we think about it, engage these conversations about race in China and the Asian studies space? And so what I want to kind of deal with this kind of question and think through it is think about one kind of prevailing nationalistic discourses and how in many cases the ideas of Blackness or this kind of desegregation or kind of disembodiment of the Black body where pieces of the Black experience or Black labor in some ways are wanted, but the idea of the Black individual and what that means are not in some ways accepted in the same ways. And thinking about these ideas of nationalism and ideas about identity and community, who belongs, who doesn't, and how we see that playing out over and over again, especially right now, considering the ways in which China is becoming a space where we have more and more engagement and contact and cooperation between China itself and multiple African nations and other individuals who identify as Black. And what I do and think about my work is I move beyond the idea of thinking about race because it does in some ways elicit a response that does not allow for further conversation. So think about historically networks of difference, how has identity been structured in modern China? So think about ideas of blood and bloodline and what does that mean? Or think about ideas of kind of patrilineage and kind of the line, the patriarchy, how we think about the kind of family descent, or thinking through ideas about the ways in which identity has been formed, thinking through issues of colonialism as well. And so how we use concept of network of difference to talk about the different ways in which identity has been formed to create a group of insiders and a group of outsiders in this particular space as well. And then how in some ways anti-Blackness really gets to this question of how do we in some ways decenter whiteness and think about addressing anti-Blackness in Asian studies in particular, thinking about China. And then also how I got to this project of Sino Black. What does this work do? And what are the conversations that hopefully will lead to more discussion about how we think about the ways in which there is some, in some ways, a difference being made and how we see that difference and in some ways value being placed on certain bodies and access allowed to different individuals and places. Right? All right, so thinking about nationalism, I wanted to kind of talk about this because as I mentioned, my work begins in modern China. And modern China, in the ways historically been defined, is thinking about the Qing dynasty. And so the Qing dynasty beginning in 1644 up until its demise and the end of the Qing dynasty in 1911, 1912, you kind of see these early ideas about identity in terms of the idea of other, ideas and questions about Chineseness, who's Chinese, especially against the backdrop of the Manchu rulers who are considered, north of China and not necessarily part of China proper, quote unquote. And so ideas of the identity of Chineseness, how we think about who is Chinese and who's not, and these ideas of identity, especially against the backdrop of a growing nation, growing dynasty. The land was growing geographically. They had more territory, but when it comes to more territories, also comes more people. And so how do you, in some ways, think about identity? Who is who, and how do you establish yourself? Who's what identity? What in some ways attributes you get those different groups against the backdrop of an increasing multi-ethnic, in some ways, a diverse state that the Qing dynasty was very much trying to promote in terms of everything it did with the 5 languages, the idea of thinking about promoting the different identities, the different people who became part of the Qing dynasty, and how we see in some ways after the Qing dynasty in some ways ends with the collapse of power, and how we see it in the Republican era as well as in the PRC today. How do you maintain such an empire? How do you maintain such a pluralistic space in the midst of against the backdrop of all these identities, and how in some ways the Han identity, the Chineseness becomes very seen as centralizing. And so nationalistic discourses allows for us to see the ways in which questions about our nation state, post the Qing dynasty, these questions that began about who is Chinese in the Qing dynasty do not in some ways end. They continue throughout the 20th century and 21st century of thinking about what is China? against this kind of changing landscape of nation states away from dynasties and empires, and to also thinking about who are the people who are part of this empire, this dynasty, and this nation state, and how do we think about this kind of imagined community as we think about the language and the terminology that of Benedict Anderson. And so nationalism also allows us to think about ethno-nationalism, how we think about the ways in which this kind of idea of ethnicity, and in some ways these ideas of how that ties into discourses, as well as discourses about gender and patriarchy. How do we see that also being tied into it as we see some of these kind of ways to think about the nation, the ways in which the nation forms identity, in some ways uses or some ways dismisses the Black body. And thinking about the idea, one of the things I realized earlier in my research thinking about African Americans is that there was an interest in the ways in which African Americans in the 20th century were thinking about their particular position in the United States. Literature, poetry coming from the Harlem Renaissance. So work by people like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay. In addition to them making their way to Asia, Claude McKay makes his way to Central Asia in the 1930s. Langston Hughes makes his way to Soviet Union, other parts of Central Asia, as well as to East Asia. He goes to China and Japan in the 1930s and writes about it his kind of semi-autobiographical text, I Wander As I Wander. And he mentions the ways in which as he's moving through these spaces, how in some ways his poetry, his literature, the work he's thinking about, how in some ways these kind of get tied into some of the kind of conversations about nationalism and nation state. An early example of this, thinking about American literature that was not written by Black Americans, but written by other Americans, is the kind of translation and incorporation of the Thomas Cabin, translated in 1901 by Lin Shu, but in many cases how the struggle of the African slave, the enslaved African American, in many cases, how it becomes almost like a warning call. If we in some ways don't do certain things, we can end up like this, but also the ways in which the story of the enslaved individual is taken out. And it's very much seen more about thinking through the plight of the coolie laborer, those individuals who left from places in East and Southeast Asia, made their way to the Caribbean in places where there in some ways is new exploited labor force. Now that in some ways, in many cases, the slave trade itself has ended in many parts of the world that had slavery eventually early on. And so the ideas about nationalism, we see in many cases as you're thinking through what China is, what China can in some ways be on this kind of new, larger slave, this kind of larger world stage that has shifted in some ways to be this kind of nation state system. You know, what is China? How do we think about Chinese identity and community? And so much of the literature in some ways thinking about how they use the literature and thinking about pushing back against imperialism, pushing back against kind of forms and systems, the legacy of imperialism is being used, especially in light of, you think about places in Shanghai and other places where you have huge concession zones and you see those legacies of imperialism in those cities up until and throughout the 1920s and 30s. As Black jazz musicians travel in China, they're in some ways still engaging and some of these legacies themselves, and how we're thinking through those conversations and how what's happening in their experiences, they're finding some kind of common denominator through kind of colonialism, pushing back against imperialistic systems and legacies, but at the same time not seeing that situation in some ways as being akin to one another. And the idea of the nation state, how it continues to have those conversations as China thinks through after the signing of the PRC in 1949, is foreign relations agenda. As we think through what happened under Mao regime, where, you know, we kind of see the disintegration of the kind of Sino-Soviet relationship, how in many cases this is very much tied to, we see the rise of China's engagement in reaching out to African nations and what that means in terms of resources, in terms of support, and how W.B. Du Bois's speech, China Africa at Beijing University in 1969 was very influential in that process and kind of furthering China's foreign relations agenda. This agenda is something we see today still, but very much one of the early examples is that in 1971, when China, what we know as kind of the PRC, was finally admitted into the United Nations as an entity, more so than the Republic of China. And so how we see what goes, how the PRC becomes recognized as an official entity, the official representative of China as a result of the relationships they built throughout the 60s and 70s through the kind of collaboration with African nations, and how we see this in the speeches, propaganda posters of kind of China, Africa, Asia, Africa, Latin America Unite, China-Africa friendships and relationships. Joe and Lai's African safari trips, we go to multiple different African nations to really start to establish different engagements. One of the most interesting things I found in Chinese archives was after there was an attempted assassination of Nkrumah, who was the president of Ghana, where Mao actually sends him a letter, kind of a telegram that says, hey, sorry somebody tried to kill you, hope you're feeling better. And so even those kind of simple things where they're kind of that connection where it shows that even in correspondence, they're building some relationships, but it was very much around the political. And so how do we get to this kind of political conversation where we're trying to embrace these different individuals, we're building a lot of relationships, to what we see where there's also this underlying tension of, in some ways, not really understanding what the Black experience is, with African Americans or individuals who come from other parts of the African diaspora. One way is kind of thinking through the conversations about slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, but there was very little information about slave trade outside of that. And so how do we in some ways think about the experience where you want to embrace either people and cultures and places, but not really understanding who they are, where their particular situation is, and how that impacts them themselves. We see this kind of dislocation and kind of this disconnect in Mao's speeches, where he's talking about, you know, how in many cases the battle against race is in some ways a step two, thinking through it and kind of in some ways combating American imperialism, and not really thinking through how the economic and the political and the racial are tied together, where you have, for instance, separate different unions based on race. You have in many cases segregation, you have blacklining, you have in many cases how geography is used, and like opportunities and resource and exposure is used in some ways to kind of keep certain systems of white supremacy intact in many parts of the United States, whether it's very overt, like we see in places in the South, or it's very systematic, we see in places in other parts of the country as well as a result of the Great Migration. And so all these different ideas of thinking through what this means in terms of nationalism, how China is in many cases as it's forming, is not about who it is, as that kind of identity continues to be shaped and reshaped. Another kind of question is thinking about the contemporary moment and what China is trying to do as a kind of superpower, kind of a global power, and how in some ways you're trying to engage the world around you. You're in some ways having new kind of contact and exposure and cooperation, but you're under the umbrella of cooperation, this increased contact, there's still this disconnect in terms of what it means, and think about the Black other, and think about Blackness in China space. How some of these discourses, these kind of stereotypes, as we'll get to in a minute, have not in some ways been dismantled. And so I think about networks of difference because it allows us to kind of think through the multiple ways in which we think about the nation state and issues of race and difference and how that plays out in different places in China. So thinking about the conversation about blood and how we see that when we talk about mixed race individuals, where if your ancestry is built on blood, what happens when your blood is also, you know, half Chinese and your other parent is of African or African American descent? What does that mean about ideas about your belonging? And so these other questions about the ways in which we create communities and thinking about the ethnic nationalities, why in some ways there is not one that's devoted to people who might be of Asian and Black descent, and the kind of connections of the diaspora, the Chinese diaspora in places that have a lot of people who are Black descent as well. How these conversations may or may not change as a result of the kind of continued increased contact between China and Africa and through the initiatives such as the Belt and Road and what happens in these spaces. And we're thinking through the long-term future impact as well. Are there going to be clashes? And is it going to be on the lines of politics, economics, or culture, as we saw what happened in April in kind of Guangzhou and the response from that? And so anti-Blackness is not a new concept, but it's very much a particular idea we think about racism in general. But anti-Blackness is a particular specific form of discrimination as it ties to the individuals who identify as Black. And in many cases, as Dr. Ross has mentioned her beautiful op-ed in the New York Times after the killing of the murder of George Floyd, where she mentions how anti-Blackness is very much particular to thinking about in ways in which you need the Black other, but you don't want them. You need the labor, you need whatever they bring to the conversation, to the space, to the labor space, but you don't want them because in some ways of what Blackness means and how we have legacies of Blackness. And so while she's very much focused on the American context, because it's in light of the murder of George Floyd, this is an idea that gets to conversations about how do we talk about specific forms of racism and difference and discrimination and how we can talk about it in the China space. And gets around the question of we're not racist because we don't have racial groups, or we in some ways don't have legacy of slavery and colonialism as it relates to African others, but you do see how these attitudes that are there, that are pervasive, that in some ways have been part of some of the kind of conversations within the China space for quite some time. It gets to question about identity, both ascribed in self, how you see yourself, but also how in some ways you're depicted and seen by others. And we'll see some of those coming through some of the kind of contemporary examples of the ways in which Blackness has been depicted, exaggerated, and in some ways negatively seen in certain lights in certain spaces in China. And I think about performative race in my work. I won't talk about it too much here, but the idea of in some ways of individuals who choose in some ways how they perform identity, how they express who they are, how they in some ways express their racial identity through their actions. And it's about a form of agency. What happens when an individual, in light of anti-Blackness, in light of the kind of conversation and context they're navigating, is choosing to embrace their Blackness and the means and formative race. And in Blackness, I go from Michelle Wright's work. I love her work on both Becoming Black as well as the Physics of Blackness. She has two really great theoretical pieces. And then can be on the piece, Physics of Blackness. I like her idea of thinking about not what Blackness is, because it leads to a very small, very finite definition, it leads to a very stagnant and in some way static definition, where she says we're not thinking about what it is, because again, we're talking about people and agency and their performativity, who they are. It's about when and where it's expressed. And it allows for us to think about this on two levels: one, the individual, and then who's in some ways asserting their Black identity and what that means for them. It allows for diversity and plurality with their identity. It allows for changes over time, so an individual can maybe express it one way when say they're 25, how that changes as a result of say other experiences and exposure. And so literally to questions of giving that identity space and room to breathe, to allow for the individual and the ability to express themselves, to have a space in that. So not trying to define and say what it is, but in some ways focus on the ways in which it is amplified and how we see this in some ways being an example. One example I've used before, and I use it again, is that when Du Bois and his wife, Shirley Grant Du Bois, went to China and they were at a dinner, they chose to sing a Negro spiritual. Why sing that kind of music? Why sing a Negro spiritual? Why sing? Why perform? And so again, this idea of you're known as being an orator, why are you singing? What does that mean in that space? And so again, this idea of how they're choosing to represent how they see themselves as Black Americans, their Blackness in that particular space. And so it also allows for us to think about the ways in which states use and deploy Blackness as well, how different people are in some ways using it either for their benefit or for the detriment of other people who identify in terms of Black and the Black individuals. And then Sino-Black relations, I know I feel like I'm talking too fast. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to get through a lot. Let me slow down a little bit. I'm getting excited. But thinking about Sino-Black relations as it relates to, as I mentioned to Evan beforehand, is it allows for me to have these kind of connections between the ways in which China engages with the Black diaspora largely across time and space. And so allows me to also connect my work, thinking about African Americans that I did for my dissertation, to my more, I'm kind of shifting in my recent work of thinking through China and thinking about the engagement to African communities in Guangzhou and other places. But also think the individuals, the mixed race identity in places, and think about how to in some ways navigate those spaces and thinking through that as well. Can you hear? Did I freeze? Did I freeze a little bit? Am I good? I'm back. Okay.
You're good. You're
okay.
Good.
It just said it was unstable, and I was like, oh no. And
but
so it allows
Keisha,
me
maybe slow down just a little bit.
Okay.
All right.
And so it allows for these conversations of thinking through Sino-Black relations to think about the larger engagements and think about China specifically as it relates to the Black diaspora. It may fall under the umbrella of Afro-Asia, which is talking about these kind of two larger diasporas of Africa and Asia coming in different ways, which they intermix and mingle, both in places outside of those two continental spaces. But I want to focus particularly on the ways in which China, in some ways, its histories and legacies relates to individuals who identify as Black and what that means for these particular relationships and engagements, encounters, however those may be, and thinking through that particular scholarship as well. So there are a few examples. I'm pretty sure some of y'all may have seen these before, and if not, here are some that we think about. And as I mentioned before, in this kind of space of increased cooperation, in this space of increased contact, whether it's through education, it's through politics, it's through labor, where you have that the factories, in some ways set up, it's through the Belt and Road, it's through political engagements, there's more cooperation. There's more contact between different people and places to identify as Black and with China space. And yet in some cases, unfortunately, there's a lot of new scholarship coming out on Africa. There's a lot of new African institutions been established in China. There's a lot more happening at the academic level. But in many cases, there's a lot, in some ways, the policies that we see coming out through kind of collaborative institutions. One is the FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where they meet and have, meetings and certain things, and they kind of talk about and put policies and kind of initiatives out there and have these conversations about what is the relationship going to look like and how we think about this kind of future engagement as we kind of make plans and continue to work together. And so you have this kind of increased kind of the exchange and encounters, but at the same time, and kind of the everyday space and other spaces like this, you still see the kind of the tropes. It's easy to kind of fall back on some of the stereotypes that have been used, not just in China, but in other places, which again gets to the question of how do we think about using anti-Blackness as a means to kind of think about the ways in which the Black other has been discriminated against specifically, and the ways in which some of these ideas are circulated globally to where you see the kind of same discrimination where they have to navigate some of these same ideas, just in different contexts and in different systems. So one of which is blackface, unfortunately, has not gone away. And there are two different examples here. The first one is from the Chinese New Year celebration, some kind of CCTV, a couple of years ago. I want to say it was 2016 or 2017. And as you can see, I put this image from the side specifically. So you can see in some ways how they're depicting both the individual, the actress here, who is, you can see she is not Black, she's actually a Chinese actress. and she's been painted in blackface, as well as they've added certain padding and cushion to her body to give her some kind of particular shape, they're trying to say. And so it's not just about just the black face, but also thinking about the ways in which the body of the black female is also being depicted in this image as well. So in addition to the black face, and again, the skit was very much about individuals who are supposed to be of African descent saying, I love China, I love China, I love China. And so in a space that's supposed to be about cooperation, we very much see this narrative of, in many cases, how China is leading Africa in many cases and not cooperating with it. And how do we get to those narratives and how we see that being reinforced? Why is this important? Because this is the information, this is the kind of idea that's been sent out to a large audience. You don't see the same kind of intellectual work that's being sent out. You don't see the articles being sent out the same way. You don't see the kind of different memos and things going out to the large mass community in China, but they are watching the Chinese New Year celebration. And what is this saying to you have millions of people who are exposed to this and in some ways find this as a means of entertainment. The ad at the bottom is more recent. And this was a piece that was covered by Black Liberty China recently, with an ad for a company called Xiaomi. And both the actors are Chinese, and they're supposed to be over some kind of dinner. And how we see in many cases, not just the black face, but also this image falls under some of the primal depictions, if you will. When an individual who's supposed to be representing someone who is closer to the Central or Southern Africa is depicted very, very dark. He has these kind of clothes on, these kind of animal prints, the way in which his clothes are structured, and how in many cases we see this very kind of a certain depiction of African individuals. And this came out recently in 2020. So it's not something that was 4 or 5 years ago. This was actually a recent ad. And again, this question of, after the backlash of the first one a couple of years ago, has China, different Chinese companies learned their lesson? And in many cases, the article is very much about, we see this idea of them being complicit in using these stereotypes to sell different products, and what is the point of this? And the one in the middle is an ad that I think a lot of people might know is from a detergent. And I remember when I first saw this, I was surprised, but not surprised. It was just a little kind of jarring, to say the least, because it came around the same time, I think, the controversy about the Dove ad here in the United States, where Dove had this campaign where different women were wearing different colored shirts, and it kind of showed that, the black lady became almost like she went from a black woman taking off a brown shirt to a white woman with a white shirt. People were like, what just happened? And so this came out in the same time. And in China, it was very much the argument that this was based off of a French advertisement. They just modified it for the Chinese audiences. And so as you see, the very kind of goes through these 4 kind of depictions, where the first, you have this individual like he's probably been painting or something. You kind of see he's they're kind of come together, like they're about to be romantic. And then what she does is she pops a detergent pod in his mouth, and then she pushes them into the washing machine. And he comes out this very light, fair-skinned Chinese guy. And again, this question of the erasure of Blackness in this particular instance. Why, in some ways, do you need to feel the erasure of Blackness to, in some ways, sell this particular ad, and why are you using this for a detergent? And if we think about some of the ads and kind of the ways in which we see kind of pure soap and other soaps that we use in kind of the height of imperialism, European imperialism, some ways the same way, this idea of erasure of Blackness, kind of cleanliness, of how in some ways Blackness is seen as dirty and not clean, and how we kind of reinforce this through certain ads, such as this detergent ad. And then the last one is from an art exhibit that was, I think, about 2017, 2018. And it was a very disturbing display, because many individuals who went to see it, there was a huge backlash to where they actually took the ad installation down, because they were having pictures of African individuals paired next to an animal. And certain animals. So again, this idea of why you in some ways depicting individuals next to these animal pairings. What is the artistic lens here? What are you trying to say? And what is in some ways the larger the overall message you're trying to do? Why this way? Why this depiction? Why this particular way in which you're kind of putting these 2 images together to contrast? What is the contrast trying to do? And so these are just some of the kind of recent examples, and thinking through what is the kind of contemporary context, which is what led to people like Jean Boyega being very frustrated about the ways in which there's this kind of culture of consumption yet rejection of Blackness, where the idea of we in some ways need to kind of want the Black labor, we want the Black market, the potential market that's there, but in many cases not necessarily the Blackness that comes with it. And I think for me, one of the questions that I'm still kind of grappling and working through is we see at the bottom with the Darky Sass Dolly toothpaste. The name has changed in English, but the Chinese is still the same. Black people's toothpaste. Hey, Ren Yagao. But the idea is that how did this go from being in some ways, as Ruth Ragazzi says, part of this kind of hygienic modernity, why does modernity and hygiene come together through the form of this kind of Hong Kong company that sells this toothpaste to the Chinese space, Whereas it's still a product today, you can go to any store and find a huge display of this toothpaste. It is a very popular brand where people like my parents use it, my grandparents use it, I use it. It's under the leadership of Colgate now. And so Colgate, an American company, is making it. And so they changed the face, which is why the face has gone from being this kind of black face, kind of minstrel vaudeville image, to a more kind of lighter, more realistic, quote unquote, depiction. But it's still the same name in Chinese, and it's still very much the same packaging. It's just kind of a new way of thinking about this same product. But I think it's interesting to think about how this was using Blackness to sell a product. The idea how this was seen as in some ways a means to, in some ways, talk about the way in which the product was effective. So how we see in many cases the erasure in some of these kind of consumption spaces as well. And I think about consumption because I'm thinking through some ideas about, thinking about neoliberalism and thinking about socialist neoliberalism. How do we see these ideas about in some ways the other, how we think about these kind of market spaces opening up and how that in some ways ties into ideas of nationalism as well as some of these long-term discourses of race. And so thinking through the instance in Black Panther, the image on the right is kind of for what we saw in other places in the world, particularly some places like the US and others, where it has the full cast. It has them in some ways kind of showing this diversity of different individuals and the kind of the Black cast, which is what made him film so popular globally. But then kind of the Chinese space, you see just the Black Panther himself, his face is covered. And there are many images similar to this where you don't see the image of the cast themselves. You don't see the main character, Chadwick Boseman, may he rest in peace. His face, you see in some ways the kind of covering of his face, the fantasy they're trying to sell, and in some ways kind of not wanting to show the diversity of the Blackness that is part of this film. So this is, and again, as we kind of, I think some of the conversations about it was that the film did not do as well as China they thought it would do. But the conversations about how many cases is advertising and the way which was marketed. I'm gonna come back to the image in the middle with John Boyega, as well as the way he was replaced for this Joe Malone, again, why for this particular market. So again, this idea of consumption, how we think about market spaces, who we selling to, and what ideas we're reinforcing when we in some ways use these particular ways of erasure or kind of manipulating the kind of conversations about Blackness in other arena spaces that is happening, and we're using this in some ways as part of targeted marketing campaigns. The image for Star Wars, I put this up here as well because I mentioned this is not first time for John Boyega where he's had to in some ways engage in this kind of conversation where his face, his image, his likeness has in some ways been reduced for the China market. With the Star Wars incident, I don't think he took it as personally, one, because I think he was excited about the film, but two, it was not his brand. It was not his particular, he didn't have control over it. It was not his control. It was part of a larger enterprise. And so what happened in that case, he was not part of the particular team that put together the initial marketing campaign. Whereas for the Joe Malone piece, it was very much his work, his ideas, his creativity, his award-winning creativity that was a place for a particular marketplace. And then last but not least, one thing about the conversation about basketball, the CBA, and there's been recent controversies recently because Ty Lawson was actually suspended indefinitely from the Chinese Basketball Association for some things that he put on tweet, some Twitter things he made, and that's another conversation for another day I can think of. But thinking about the ways in which the CBA has embraced certain individuals, like Stephon Marbury, where this is an image from, I have a whole museum dedicated and devoted to him because his contributions to the Chinese Basketball Association, both as a player and now at his retirement as a coach. And so what does it mean in terms of thinking about ideas of how do we think about the bodies that are valued? Is it for their contribution or is it for their labor? And thinking through how do we get from this point of selling things with the darky dolly toothpaste, so now in some ways the Blackness is in some ways minimized, erased, or covered up to in other ways sell to a consumer body where people think that is what they want to see and why. And how does this have impact in terms of thinking through the ways in which we are supporting, encouraging, in some ways buying into this in terms of thinking about consumption and who's the market, what are we trying to do, what are we selling, and it's kind of simultaneously rejection of the Black other in some of these places. And then last but not least, thinking about the impact. This is an image from the left where it comes through from some of the incidents where some of the individuals who are African descent who are living in Guangzhou and places in southern China, after this kind of huge backlash, they were in some ways forced to be tested for COVID-19, even though they had not been outside or different places, they had been following the quarantine orders. They had in some ways been barred from different stores and shops. And there's videos of that all over social media and how some of them had been evicted from their residency. And this is an image of some of them actually sleeping outside because they were no longer allowed to live in places where they had lived. And so it has a real impact in terms of these ideas and how they see the Black other. I read some really good research recently where the idea of thinking about pathogens and race and nationality is not new. How thinking about the ways in which the framing of conversation about HIV and AIDS, how in some cases the way it's been talked about in China, is thinking through and engaging these conversations about how it's very much tied to a geography, how they talk about it and the ways it's depicted, and how they use Africans in those images to kind of depict this idea of race, nationality, and disease and pathogens. And so there's a legacy of it in China, but I think the COVID-19 has a different impact because of the ways in which there was so much anti-Asian sentiment, backlash, and racism as a result of the virus going global and making a pandemic, and how in some ways you can go back and do the same thing to a group of people, especially since you know how that feels. And so these are statements from the open letter for individuals who live in the space who came together to African Union to say, we need to discuss this. This has been happening. This is going on. This was happening now. And then the second part in some ways addresses the ways in which this has a history and a legacy. And we need to address these issues in order to move forward. This is not new. But if we're saying in things in spaces like the FOCAC, that we're talking about collaboration and cooperation, and we're talking about dignity and human sovereignty and human rights, we also need to see that happening everywhere, especially if we talk about the ways in which the Chinese government and the populace in some ways engaging with us in this particular space. And I'll share the PowerPoint so I'll go back and look at the letter itself. It's a little bit longer than this, but I have the link here where I encourage you to go back and read it, because the letter came out on April 19th and really trying to deal with some of these questions and the ways in which the African Union, as an institution that has weight behind it, can support its individuals who are living, working, and studying in China. What can you do in some ways to address these questions and concerns that we as individuals have in this particular space? So I hate to move on to the next one because I know people don't want to read it, but I want to think about moving forward. I'm thinking about the conversations. And so thinking about this idea of thinking about Blackness and the conversations about it, and in some ways the ways in which it manifests itself, thinking about how we think about mixed race identity. And so here I have a picture of Hui Ding, who is of African and Chinese descent. And he was the first individual of his background to make it to the Chinese national volleyball team back in the early 2000s. And then the other picture is of Lo Jing, who became famous nationwide in China, in some ways globally, because of the ways in which she was discussed, talked about, and treated on a Chinese kind of a reality show that's similar to our singing competitions here, like Who Wants to, America's Next American Idol, and those kind of shows where you come on and you sing. And I think in this case, and I think Taj Frazier and Ling Zhang have a really good analysis of how it wasn't just about the ways in which she was kind of discussed, what they call her chocolate girl, so the use of that, but the focus on her physicalness more so than her actual talent itself. And then this picture up here I chose is because, on this show, they want to show you the person, the person behind the person, how they become this individual, what was their life story like, the kind of the tear jerk moments. Well, this became a space where it was almost a conversation where they were antagonizing her and her mother and asking her mother some ways, idea of how dare you, in some ways, have a relationship with a man who her daughter's father's African-American. Questions about, why in some ways have a relationship with the African-American man, you're a single mother. There's almost this conversation where there's some kind of moral judgment placed on her for her kind of relationship and for her daughter having the parentage that she does have. And so it becomes these questions of how we think about this as well. And we think about the instance where there might be more individuals like this coming in the future, considering the ways in which China and African nations and people of the African diaspora are engaging with mixing and mingling with China. It also gets to questions about, as I think Evan mentioned earlier, about the kind of 1988 incidents where we had this kind of incidents and backlash against African nationals, particularly men, especially since they were dating Chinese women. And so the idea is that, is it okay more so for Chinese men to date non-Chinese women, or more so for Chinese women to date non-Chinese men? And if so, what is the kind of acceptable non-Chinese male that women can date and kind of have relationships with? And these questions about nationality and the future and who's included, who's excluded, and how we get to these questions of identity and inclusion and community, that in some ways, how do we think about this when one of your identities is in some ways negated or seen as less than in a particular space? And last but not least, there's recently been a piece by NPR that comes out, and it's going to be a new adaptation. It's going to be the first time ever of A Raisin in the Sun in China by a Chinese production. And so it gets to questions. I think the article, I'll put the link here, and again, I will share the PowerPoint. It gets to really good questions about appropriation or appreciation, because one of the points that was mentioned was that the guy who's in some ways in charge of producing the show is encouraging, kind of wants to think about, can we or should we use darker makeup Should we make it where we focus on a kind of a Chinese adaptation where it's about a Chinese family, maybe dealing with some of the same issues? Should we stick to Lorraine Hansberry original vision, but just with Chinese actors? How do we think about these questions and think through this as it relates to kind of these understandings? I think I like this kind of in right here and think about this because it leads to the idea that there are having these conversations, the conversation happening in China by Chinese audiences. And so it's not just the idea there's, overwhelming everyone in China is anti-Black, but the questions about and thinking through appropriation or appreciation and how we navigate that fine line. We want to show appreciation to a particular work of art, but also how to make sure that we do so in a way that's respectful and not mimicking some of the ways in which we see blackface happen on a larger scale. And with that being said, here's a list of links and different resources, different organizations and pieces and articles that I think we might really be able to help kind of continue this conversation beyond today's phone call. So ideas of thinking through some of these questions and topics moving forward and thinking about how we can engage in these conversations about issues of race difference and anti-Blackness as it relates to the China space. And with that being said, I think my time is up. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Keisha. Wonderful. Wonderful presentation. It was both theoretically sophisticated, very, very empirically rich. I appreciate you sharing these resources. I'm going to start off with 2 quick questions and then open it up. Just mindful that it's now 4:47, so we're going to have to go over, 5 p.m. But we'll go as long as sort of I can last and questions less. So my question for you, Keisha, is number one. How have Chinese views of Blacks in the Black diaspora changed over time, right? I mean, I used to study a lot of, W.B. Du Bois. I had no idea he went to China. Have Chinese views of Blacks and Blackness changed substantially in the modern era, and sort of how have they changed? Is it largely been through things like interaction with the NBA and Hollywood? So drawing that out. And number 2, are there any Chinese scholars that do research on, the same issue that you work on, sort of, Blackness in China? Who do you talk to? Who are your Chinese equivalents, your Chinese colleagues? So those are my 2 opening questions.
Thank you. So I think your first question about Chinese views of Blacks in the Black diaspora, how has it changed over time? I'm thinking one of the ways I think about it and thinking through it is thinking about the 20th century itself and thinking about the long kind of historical arc and how we see that changing, where kind of early on it was the idea of kind of the Black experience as kind of a mirror to kind of think about how we can think about our own identity as a nation, as a people, and how we can in some ways use some of those models, but not necessarily including some of those Black voices in that space. And then under the PRC, it becomes very politically charged. How does China really want to put itself out there? PRC as its kind of new governing body, as its new government, establish both the kind of its authority as well as its authenticity to be the government. And we see this very much through its foreign relations, where it's really trying to engage in people in places that in some way they don't always have conversations. And so I think about Mao and the PRC. They very much engage in conversations with African Americans, particularly African Americans. Those have a platform, those who in some ways leaving and in some ways in exile. So Du Bois and his wife, they leave the US, they move to Ghana, they go to China a few times. We think about Robert F. Williams and his wife and their 2 sons, where they're in exile, leaving the US after the incident in South Carolina, go to Cuba and then leave Cuba and come to China. And so their engagement with individuals have a platform because one, Du Bois is known in the African diaspora. People are respecting him for his work and his legacies of work. And then 2, Robert F. Williams has a whole publication. He's thinking through his whole global newsletter, The Black Crusader, that goes out to the point of where the Chinese government is still paying for him to put it out there while they're in China and shipping it back to the US to be distributed to his readership. And so there's a kind of very particular political moment there where they're trying to in some ways continue to build China's a kind of authority and kind of legitimacy as they're kind of thinking about them as a new government, thinking about their role in kind of this growing kind of the third world color solidarity movement, and where China sees itself in this kind of color solidarity, how they're pulling in African Americans, particularly with the phrase over and over repeated that we're trying to in some ways dismantle and kind of make American imperialism implode. And we see that happening in the writing, the readership, the People's Daily articles of China, Mao's kind of conversation about it, his statements of support that are reprinted every year. They're released on certain dates, 1963 on the eve of March in Washington, 1968 after the assassination of Dr. King. And so there's very intentional ways of thinking about it, but it's very much as political part of a larger political kind of foreign relations agenda. And then we kind of see in some ways kind of the result of kind of the opening up like a Kaifeng, kind of Nixon visit in 1972. Prior to that, the ways in which it changes, where we kind of see a lack of this kind of political engagement as much, and more in terms of like something about global culture and globalization, the idea of consumption of pop culture, to where you have this idea of you see certain films and things. One example I give is that the last time one of the previous times I was in China, Tyler Perry's film, his Medea films made their way to China. And so for me, that's kind of challenging to think about what it means where you have this Black male and this kind of exaggerated Black female kind of costume and things, and how we see that happening where if, as I'm a Black woman navigating the spaces in China, how am I supposed to navigate those? And as you see, looking at the ideas of consumption and rejection, it's very little already to begin as it relates to Black women. There's more about Black men as a result of popularity of things like certain musical styles, like rap music and things, as a result of kind of, basketball and other kind of pop culture icons and identities where there's very little Black females in that space. And so what happens when that makes its way to China, and how we think about that as a means of how Black women have to navigate that space as well. And so I think it's gone over an arc of where it's been a kind of idea of how we see as a mirror as we think about our own identity, to very much about ideas of politics and growing foreign relations, to now very much idea of kind of very much the idea of consumption, where there's a lot of cooperation, but not a lot of, in some ways, engagement. And I think for me, one other example is I was in China in January before we could no longer travel. And I had a chance to go to different corporations. And while it was very interesting where they all have these beautiful museums they show where they're putting different factories and things, I think for me, I was very disheartened to see that while they're all building factories for the labor, they're not putting distribution or management sites anywhere in Africa. So again, you have this kind of region, you have the North America region, you have the European division. Where's the African division? Why only building manufacturing sites, only building factories and not anything else? And so I think there's still this idea of we want the market, want the potential market, want the potential labor, but not necessarily in some ways including those people and how we see that playing out. And for instance, the recent kind of conversations about the policies regarding citizenship and kind of people getting their residency status, and how those conversations did tie into conversations about race and about the non-Chinese, the Black other. Oh, and second question, my Chinese counterparts.
Yeah, just quickly, just very quickly.
And so there are a few scholars I've been coming across recently. I think some individuals I talk to and think about these conversations, both on the China and the US side, are people who are kind of coming up behind me, which I love it. So you have people like Rodi Duan, who I work with. We did the Teaching China Through Black History conversation. I also, so we'll talk a little bit with her. There's also another student, Zufan Liu, who does the opposite. He looks at, he's a Chinese, an individual, Chinese national, but he's doing his grad work here in the US. His research into African American history has led him to do work on Claudia Jones and others. And so we're having these kind of conversations. It's a lot dealing with a lot of younger scholars who are engaged in these conversations. I also had the chance to work with a student named Daisy Xu, who is a student. She did her undergrad work here in the US, but she's back in China doing her grad work. And she actually produced, because she's a communications major, a whole project, a video series about what does it mean to be Black in China. And so I see that the individuals who are coming out now are actually engaging in some of these conversations, in addition to reading some of the scholarship by others. A lot of interesting dissertations and works about Black women's literature, so Black women's literature, and kind of engaging with those conversations as well, to think about, where are they gravitating to these topics and thinking about it as well.
Great, wonderful, Keisha. So Keisha, we've got questions from two of Georgetown's heavyweights, Jim Millward and Yuki Kajima. So so let's start with you, Jim.
Okay, more heavyweight now than I was before COVID began, unfortunately. Many of us can say that. So I'm really curious about, and I apologize a little in advance for pivoting to what I'm working on. I guess that's what one does, right? But I've been struck in the just in the Twitter space, for example. I will say something along the lines of China is putting Uyghurs in concentration camps, or the CCP is putting Uyghurs in concentration camps, and then some response will say, well, what about how America treats Black people, right? Yeah. Which is a trolley response, a whataboutism and so on, but also actually shows an association, which is quite a curious one, I think. But I wanted, before I sort of read too much into that, I wanted to ask you how you think, or if you think, anti-Blackness, in what ways do you think anti-Blackness is related to, the Minzu discourses and discrimination, which is, quite obvious in China as well? That's the first question. How would they relate? And then the second question is, in having the conversations which I'm now having with Chinese authorities and with Chinese people and so on, do you think it's valuable to talk about either anti-Blackness in China or anti-Blackness in the United States as a, I don't know, as a way of evening the field, or as a teaching to, as a heuristic, or I don't know. I mean, I wondered if you've, gotten into those comparative conversations about othering in both societies, and what you can tell me about it.
So thank you for that question. Again, thank you for your email earlier. I saw your email. I haven't had a chance to respond, but thank you for your encouraging email earlier. So thinking about the conversation about anti-Blackness and kind of in the Me Too and discrimination spaces, I think that's also another place I'm kind of thinking through, because we think about, look at early on the PRC, this kind of process of creating the Me Too, right? How we go from, as kind of Thomas Mulaney discusses, you have all these different individuals, and how do you go from all these different identities into what we call this like nice, neat 56? And also the question of why has the 56 not in some ways expanded as China has grown throughout the period of the PRC's history now. And so again, I think these questions about othering and how we create this idea of who are we and who is this other, in some ways is these really kind of interesting conversations. And I get a good example is kind of going to your point about the online conversation, is how we see Han chauvinism very much come in these online spaces where people feel okay behind the trolling or the kind of anonymity of the internet to say some really horrible things and say things that are in some ways really put out these ideas of how they see other people that they might not necessarily say in front of them. And so this idea of how we see this happening, not just in kind of in person, but also in internet spaces, online. I think that's one of the things about the Lo Jing example, where it's like people said all kind of horrible things about her and her mother in the kind of online space, and how, as I mentioned, the Ty Lawson example, where he in some ways mentioned on Instagram, this is why, I tell students, please think about what you put on social media before you put it up there, because it can never go away. But he put a picture on Instagram where he says Chinese women have cakes, meaning he thinks they have figures and shapes, and I guess he likes them. And then he put an image of him in a nightclub. I guess it's him and a Chinese woman, they're dancing. I can't tell you what's going on because the picture is a little weird. So there are some issues there about what's happening in terms of questions of gender. But I think the question about race, where the comments to him were very much about Black this, Black that, and very derogatory terms about his Blackness and anything else. And then mind you, this is a guy who has, he's in Fujian playing basketball. And so he has this kind of notoriety, and yet this is something that's also happening. So I think it's very much tied to the ways in which we other people. I think in many cases when it comes to Blackness, it's seen as kind of outside of it. So you're other, but you're this kind of foreign other. And this idea, at least what that means, you're part of this 56, you can belong, and even if it's theoretical. But for in terms of Blackness, like, you can never be seen as kind of belonging. So I think that's kind of what gets the questions of confusion and kind of, this idea of like the what's called double consciousness. When we think about what happens to these mixed race individuals who are, one of your identities is not seen as compatible to the nation state identity or the ideas of how it sees itself. In terms about is it valuable to talk about anti-Blackness, I get that all the time where I mention something. And I mean, recently, I just started using social media recently, thanks to PIP program. They're talking about being public out there. And so I used Twitter, and I had forwarded the beautiful Georgetown advertisement for the event. And everyone was really positive. And then this one guy decided to say, ask something very rude, and was like, why are you so focused on what's happening over there and not over here? And he put some very derogatory about, well, because you're getting paid by these white schools. And I was like, whoa, so you don't know me, anything about me. But again, it's the idea of kind of deflecting how that happens on not just the China side, but also on the US side as well. Why not focus on the domestic issues of racism as well? And so I think those conversations about discrimination, whether it's talking about the concentration camps of the Uyghurs, we need to have those conversations, how it's tied into these larger processes of how we in some ways discriminate and make difference. And I think in many cases, the idea about discussing America's racism has always been used by the PRC. Even we see it with Mao as well. He, calling kind of coming from the Soviet Union, the idea of racism, American Achilles heel. Yes, we have our own issues, we do, but at the same time, it's not useful to use that to deflect from their own particular issues. And I think it's a useful means to think about how they're trying to in some ways deflect. And so I think if we kind of hold our own self to say, yes, we have our problems too, but that's not to away from the fact that you also have your problems. I think we need to have the way in which we can kind of in some ways embrace our own shortcomings, embrace our own kind of shortfalls, but also show how in many cases we're thinking about the larger ways in which these nation states, especially as China and the US are becoming so domestically focused. We think about how we need to have those conversations in the US-China space about the ways in which these nation states are in some ways discriminating and othering, and in some ways leading to a loss of life, and the ways in which you see kind of whose life is valuable. And I think we had those conversations, and it's okay to say, yes, our house is not in order. but neither is yours. And here's how we can have some conversations about that and use those ways to say we're not going to leverage one over the other to say one is better or worse than the other. They're both problematic, and here's why. And let's talk about it and think through it and think about just the human cost and human value and whose lives are valuable and who's not.
Thanks.
Keisha, would you mind stopping the sharing? We'll make sure to distribute
okay.
the slides for anybody. That way we can we can see everybody more more clearly, more robustly, including you. Okay, so let's next go to Yuki.
Hi, thank you so much for the really great presentation. Actually, I wanted to, what really struck a chord with me, I'm a Southeast Asianist, and when you were talking about Benedict Anderson and just drawing this beautiful arc of history of sort of, tying in anti-Blackness into the, and then the solidarity with Africans and African Americans through colonialism. Because, as you are, citing Ben Anderson, I'm thinking about, how they used the solidarity with, in terms of fighting against colonialism for their independence and building a new nation throughout the region, not just in China, but also in Southeast Asia. And sort of made me think, well, the motivation is, well, they're trying to fight against white supremacy or European supremacy. But then as you go along in history, China becomes more and more confident as an independent country, and then now emerging as a superpower. It made me wonder, when you're starting to shift to this sort of powerful position, is that changing the nature of Sino-Black relations? And also sort of linked in with Jim's question, if solidarity with oppressed people is the motivation, with these original ties, I was wondering how, whether or not the minorities within China, for example, in Xinjiang or in Tibet or other regions, are they seeing linkages to the struggle, global Black Power or Black Lives Matter movement? Are there any linkages there as well within the minority communities in China? Thank you.
So thank you for your great questions. So I'm trying to think through, especially the last one, thinking about the connections and linkages to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've seen some ways in which we have seen the movement and the strength of it, and the ways in which we're trying to, in some ways, push back against some of these narratives has inspired communities in many ways, but I haven't really thought about it in terms of the minorities in China. So I think that's a space where I need to do a little bit more work about that, because I can see it. And I think one of the overall kind of overwhelming narratives is how we see this happening in places like Hong Kong with their kind of protests, but we don't see the conversations about how it's happening with other people in the China space and how the Black Lives Matter there, the movement is in some ways connecting with them. And so I'm not sure, but that's another great question to think about, into thinking about, the ways in which these movements and can in some ways impact different communities within China. So breaking it down to the individual. So I have to do more work on that. So I don't have an answer for you on that one. So my apologies on that. But thinking through how is the arc of China's kind of change in some ways impacted changing Sino-Black relations? I do think there is a change. So for instance, thinking about the early PRC, if you will, when they're in this moment of they're still trying to establish themselves, they're still a young nation, they're the young government, they're using kind of these linkages to African nations to say, let's build collaboration and cooperation. They're offering to provide resources. They're offering to provide, I think one of the things, they have a guerrilla warfare camp in Southern China where these individuals can go to learn guerrilla warfare tactics. I was like, this is so cool. But thinking about it as well in terms of other resources, in terms of loans, they're offering kind of lower interest loans than places in the Western world. So places like the United States, other parts of Europe. And so there really is a kind of idea of we're going to work together, thinking through the kind of Bandung spirit, the Bandung moment, the idea of color solidarity. But as China continues to grow and it comes kind of the economic power, and we see the kind of changes over time, I do see it as less of an idea of collaboration and cooperation. And it feels like, to me, it's more about the idea of exploitation. collaboration, and what in some ways can China get out of these particular relationships. So I think the idea of collaboration in some ways has diminished, and it's more about the idea of exploitation. Again, if it's about collaboration and about encouragement, then why in some ways are we having these moments of backlash, and why are we not in some ways trying to change these conversations in the local populace? How are we not trying to change the minds of the people? There should in some ways, through collaboration. And so I guess for me, a good example is that in Vicky Garvin's case, when she goes to China and she's there during the Cultural Revolution, she's first in Shanghai. She's teaching English through Black history, which I think is awesome. And her archives at the Schomburg Center, when they sell lesson plans, is very amazing, where she's teaching English through Black history to grad students. But then she has to leave because, again, school shut down, Cultural Revolution takes off. She moves to Beijing, worked for the Foreign Language Press as an English polisher. But I mention her because in '68, after the assassination of the king, and Mao issues his next statement of solidarity to African Americans, she and her students are crying. They're listening to the statement, they're reading, and they're crying together. And so you had this moment of there's some kind of connective tissue, whatever it is, where they're both crying. They're so moved to tears by the words of Mao. And again, she doesn't speak Chinese, so her students translating for her. But the idea is that there's something there in that moment. I don't think we will see that right now. I really don't. I don't think there's that kind of connection where I think a lot of the initiatives where it feels more about China, feels like if it's leading these nations and it's leading the hand versus we're working with you, and how they're using that, and how the companies are able to in some ways get around it and use the labor and kind of really exploit it, how they're using language, the idea of teaching a lot of Chinese and Chinese early on in schools and different places where they start as early as kindergarten. So it's almost like this early kind of extension, or kind of in some ways we're using the language and the tools to kind of build this interest. But then what happens when you actually try to access China, and what happens in those places where this is the dream? Is a China dream also extended to people in Africa? And I don't think so.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very interesting.
Wonderful. Let's see. We've got Jomo Smith and Keisha Cook. So why don't we do this, Keisha, because we're well over 5. Why don't we ask Jomo and Keisha to ask their questions, and then you can answer them collectively. So first over to you, Jomo.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Keisha, for that presentation, and very nice to see everyone here. So I'm wondering if we can just extend the topic somewhat broadly by thinking about a global concept of Blackness, and a concept of Blackness that is not necessarily limited to those who come from Africa. And so I'm again doing a bit of what Jim Millward was saying earlier, sort of connecting this to my own work, which is focused on Chinese Muslims and Tibetans in Gansu province. But I'm trying to sort of think about and tie a couple of different moments here. So that a moment that is sort of like based in history, and then a moment that is sort of based in contemporary politics, right? And so specifically contemporary politics, I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I don't spend a lot of time reading this type of literature, but recently I've been exposed to like works, for example, of transnational Blackness, navigating global color lines. So this is by Marble and Agar Jones, and so there is a concept of global Blackness that we can think about that, again, is not limited to Africa, right, or African descendants, and I think it's very interesting to think about that in the context of various things that are going on in China today, right? And so let me just expand the topic a little bit more. And when we think about this Chinese consciousness of Blackness, you have works, for example, talking about the Kunlun slaves, by Dodd Wyatt, right? And we're really beginning to sort of wonder, well, when did this Chinese consciousness of Blackness come about? And so what I'm trying to understand and think about is this concept of Blackness or fear or disdain or disgust, whatever sort of adjective you want to add to that of Blackness among some Chinese, is that something that is endemic? Is that something that we're seeing more recently in its recent apparitions as a result of capitalism, of a very sort of horrible form of exploitative capitalism? I mean, the thing that Marxists should have a problem with. But so how do we understand where this is actually coming from, right? How do we historicize it? And then how do we present it in a way that fits into this global discussion that some people are having, which ties in to the Black Lives Matter movement? Thanks.
And please answer that in 30 seconds or less. So Keisha,
are
over
we
to
going to
you.
pair them together? Are we pairing the
Yeah,
questions?
why don't we pair them together just to save time. So Keisha, over to you, please.
Thank you, Dr. Medeiros. And thank you, Dr. Brown, for coming to speak with us today. I am a first-year MAJA student or Asian Studies student at Georgetown. And my question, I'm an aspiring diplomat. So what are some of the potential harms or negative perceptions or reactions from the CCP one can anticipate when, you know, performing research along the lines of anti-Blackness in China in what you study? And then also for students as well who are interested in this topic, who are in China, what are some of those anticipated reactions?
Great question. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Brown, over to you.
So thank you. So I guess I'll start with Keisha's question first and thinking through anticipated reactions. I think one of the things I try to, in some ways, kind of instill in my students, and especially thinking about going abroad, is one, kind of know that you think about different forms of discrimination against Blackness, how in some ways it's different in China. So in different ways for thinking, for example, how, you know, in the US, somebody wants to come up and touch my afro, was like, no, I'm not your pet. Like, why do you want to touch me, right? The other way in which in many cases, when I had this experience in China, it's because they had never really interacted with me before. Never seen anybody who looked like me. I was like one of like the only person they probably had seen in that particular space. And so I think the idea of when you go to China, people are staring at you, they're going to try to touch your hair and skin. It comes from different places. In many cases, there is some kind of sentiments of anti-Blackness that combined with just kind of a curiosity because they've never seen anybody look like you. I remember one of the interesting examples is that I was in Beijing and there's a family you could tell from like a rural area. They came to Beijing to travel, and they just threw their baby in my arms, took a picture, and I was like, okay. So I'm in someone's household somewhere. There's a picture of me with this random Chinese baby. I don't know why. I guess I might bring good luck. I don't know. But the goal is that you're going to have these moments where it's going to be where there are going to be instances where it is going to be someone just trying to, in some ways, you know, have these ideas of anti-Blackness. But in some cases, it's just a different level of curiosity because they have never seen anyone who looks like you. I think if you have the language skills, it helps navigate that space more. You can understand where they're coming from, what's their intention, because you are in some ways like, okay, what is the intention behind it? I will say you might in some ways, we go to certain spaces, especially as a diplomat, because in some ways confront the idea that, in some ways, the idea that, you know, how you in some ways situate in that space, the idea that, you know, how does someone who looks like you in some ways belong in those kind of conversations. And I've had those moments where I'm in certain meetings where they were very surprised to see someone who looked like me come into the meeting and speak Chinese. And so there is going to be those moments where there is, in some cases, you know, how do we navigate this space, as well as thinking about if you're working as a diplomat, what they think about Americanness and how many cases American identity is still seen very much as white, blonde hair, blue eyed. So you say you work on behalf of the American government, how in some ways that's also sometimes your nationality might be challenged based upon the ways in which you look and identify. So there's a lot of different levels to it in terms of what you can anticipate, but I will say just in some ways kind of know what, you know, that's going to happen in some ways, but also in some ways don't shy away from having those conversations. I mean, every time I get in a taxi, I first land in Beijing, they're like, oh, what part are you African from? I'm not. Why did you ask me the question? Why did you make that conversation? Why is that the assumption that you make? And I use those as a means to kind of become conversation starters while you have those conversations and conceptions. And so it's a lot of ways that you can handle it and how you can go about and dealing with it and navigating it. But there might be different levels of interaction, especially if you're in that diplomatic space and what that means as well. I will say maybe one of the good things to think about is to think about touching base with individuals who are part of an organization I'm part of called NABIA, National Association of Black Engagement with East Asia, where a lot of them are working in the foreign service sector, and they can give you more examples about how they've navigated working in East Asia and being a Black person in those places where they have examples of how to navigate and how to anticipate what will happen in those particular places and conversations as well. And I think that was on the slide with the LinkedIn resources. All right. Thank you. Hope that answered your question. And then going back to Jomo's question, sorry, I'm like speed racing through them, but thinking about the question of transnational Blackness. I'm going beyond thinking about, say, the Black diaspora to these larger conversations about transnational Blackness. And thinking about the transnational work as well, kind of thinking through that as well. There's some really great studies out there, as you mentioned, about thinking through transnational understandings of Blackness. One of my favorite is thinking about To Turn the Whole World on Fire. It's more contemporary. And it's thinking about gender and race, thinking about kind of transnationalism and thinking about it through different ways. And so they have articles and different pieces as well. So it's thinking about this kind of transnational identity and Blackness in certain ways and spaces. And so to think about how do we think about the origins and how do we think about it historically, but also how we put this into the current conversation. One way is that I found it in many cases in my research, it's about in some ways putting pieces together. So I read a recent article where they talk about going back to the Qing dynasty, different literature and folklore, where it talks about Blackness and what Blackness means and how that looks. Thinking, as you mentioned, the Quinlan Slave, or even other books such as the Peaches of Samarkand, kind of other earlier texts, how they're thinking about Blackness. I think for me, one of the first questions is, in many cases, it wasn't just people who were from, who looked Black. It was people who looked darker than who the writer was. So it could be someone who could be Southeast Asian, because in some ways, thinking about geography, thinking about climate, they are darker due to where they're located in terms of close to the equator. So what Blackness is and how we think about those early origins, we see, I think the way to kind of think about it is to find those moments, those texts, those incidents, and try to see in some ways, one, how does it change over time? And then two, thinking about what are some of the ways in which it hasn't changed? How do we see where it becomes a question of just difference to a question of difference with distinction and giving preferential treatment for one over the other? And so as you mentioned about your work on Chinese Muslims and Tibetans, and thinking through how we're thinking about that combined with thinking about, the contemporary of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there's a lot to think about transnational Blackness and thinking about the Chinese consciousness in that space, and how the Chinese consciousness has kind of shaped and changed throughout these periods, or how we can think about, has it shaped, has it changed, is it going to change, and why or why not? Hope I answered your question. I don't know if I did. I'm just trying to make sure I touch all the points that you mentioned. Thinking about exploitative capitalism, but I'd be more than happy to kind of continue in these conversations further after this particular call today. I'm sorry, it was like 30 seconds. So sorry.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Keisha, that was wonderful. You've been incredibly generous with your time. You've improved our understanding of racism, Blackness as it applies to China. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, obviously relevant to the conversation that's going on within America today. So everybody, please join me in thanking Dr. Keisha Brown. That was just spectacular.
Thank you. Thank you.
Obviously, once campus opens up, we need to have you back as the conversation in the United States evolves, and of course, as China's interactions with the African American, the African world continues to evolve. So this is great. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Keisha, please send us a copy of your PowerPoint slides. If anybody would like a copy, please reach out to Stephanie Gage. Again, this is being recorded. So for those of you that want to go back and take a look, it's going to be in the, I think, on the Asian Studies website. So with that, let's, again, thank you, Keisha, and thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your evening.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.